this.
Okay. What are we doing today?
Hello, doing good.
Okay. Just waiting for the room to come alive here. Okay, there we go. So we last left off, we're talking about kind of the sticky physiology of the neuromuscular junction and the resting membrane potential. So if you recall before we kind of left off, we were talking about how you can basically create a stabilized resting membrane potential that hovers right around minus 70 millivolts by having a combination of sodium potassium pump along with your leak channels to kind of maintain that you don't have infinite buildup, right? Because that'll create that kind of static electrical charge. And we took a look at the action potential curve, the depolarization and the repolarization curves associated with action potential. And so now we are basically taking a look at a couple of things. First of all, the layout of propagation. So that's the next place we want to go. And then we kind of put it all together. Remember, we said we're kind of covering modules of this, some stuff at the end, some stuff at the beginning, and then we're going to kind of tie it all together in one kind of like from the beginning to the end kind of a process. So the first thing to understand is like when you first take a look at your resting membrane potential, so at rest basically, you have essentially a situation where your sodium voltage gates are going to be closed. And so that's these pink guys here, right? So these guys are closed, which basically maintains your concentration gradient. So essentially they're not going to release because you don't want them to release unless you're ready for an action potential. So you're not there yet, right? And then in addition to that, you also have some of your potassium channels, not all of them, which are the red ones. Some of them are closed and some of them are open. So for instance, you can see one here that is closed and one here that is open. So this is the so-called leak channel. And so what this is doing, this is essentially balancing the charge buildup so that you don't get that excessive positive charge, right? So you don't basically want that to create a situation where you have too much positive charge built up. And so that's kind of where that is going. And so this is basically what you have at rest. And so you're maintaining this gradient, this sodium gradient, and then that resting membrane potential. Now what happens when you go to depolarize, so you're going to start the depolarization process. In this particular case, usually the sodium channels, often a ligand gated channel, which is the reason why I did the ligand gated version of the channel when I wrote down the channelology slide, is because typically it's a ligand gated channel that kicks it off. It's kind of the tipping of that first domino, if you will. And then after that, it's voltage gated. Those will open up and then allows the sodium to diffuse down. Now, it sounds like such a passive word. Really, the sodium is rushing in, right? So it's kind of like a broken dam at this point. So you can see then what happens is the sodium, once those channels open up, will flow down its gradient and will basically rush into the cell. And as it rushes into the cell, it's going to make the inside of the cell more positively charged because you are rushing positive charge into the cell itself. That flips that charge. right? So instead of being slightly negative on the inside, that's now slightly positive on the inside because of the inrush of sodium. And that's basically your depolarization. So you're basically flipping the polarity of that sort of charge distribution across the membrane itself. So that's the depolarization event. So now you basically have this charge flip. So you can see here, basically you start off with resting. And now under depolarization, you can see you flip the charge. So resting, by the way, you had the charge separated with positive on the outside, negative on the inside. And then once you allow that sodium to rush in, it's going to flip that charge. So now instead, you've got the positive charge on the inside, the negative on the outside. And then once that occurs, then we go to repolarization. And in repolarization, remember, this is the peak of the curve here. So basically, we reach our max depolarization at the peak of the curve. And then the downside of the curve is going to be repolarization. The first thing that has to happen is obviously you have to close your sodium gates. You can't keep letting that sodium come through if you want to reset your system, right? That's just kind of like, you know, a leaky faucet. You're basically having to kind of bail water, so to speak. And so what happens with repolarization is you shut those sodium channels to disallow extra ion flow. And then you start to open up more potassium channels, not so much the leak channels, or the leak channels are already open, right? So those are just kind of passively kind of coming in and coming out to sort of keep the things balanced and maintained. But now what's going to happen is you're going to open more potassium channels, and then the potassium movement is going to be going out of the cell. So you can see, now you can see the sodium channels have closed and the potassium channels have opened up, or more of them have opened up. So now you're starting to get diffusion, not just through the leak channel, that's this guy over here, but now through this other potassium channel, which is basically held in reserve for this repolarization moment. And then you're going to have basically an upregulation of potassium moving out. And so what this does, basically, it makes the inside of the cell membrane negative again. Why? Because potassium, which is also positively charged, is going to be moving out. So what you have is kind of like this sort of counterbalance kind of a situation. In a lot of ways, the inrush of sodium with the consequent outrush of potassium is kind of a lot like managing a sail on a sailboat, right? So if you ever watch it, those sail races on the Atlantic, right? You kind of see these guys sort of holding on to the sails, and you can kind of see them sort of throwing their body around, trying to manipulate the sail itself. And so what's happening is, as the wind is blowing the sail in one direction, they're using their body weight as a counterbalance to keep that sail from basically tearing loose and essentially flapping in the breeze, right? So what's controlling the nature and the direction and the angle of that sail to catch as much wind as possible is the counterbalance of their body weight working in opposition to the force of the boom, which is basically swinging under the force of the wind in the sails. And the same thing's true here. You're using potassium as sort of like a counterbalance to the inrush of sodium, and that kind of keeps the system from completely going to completion. And so this potassium outrush is then the beginning of your resetting. Okay, so this is kind of like the sort of all in one place piece of at least action potential generation. So remember, at the beginning, when you don't have an action potential coming through, your muscle fiber itself is sitting at rest. So it's got resting membrane potential. That basically means that it's basically here at this minus 70 or so, right? So here's your resting membrane potential right around this area. And so this is what it looks like. So basically you have your sodium channels are closed for the most part. You have a couple of channels that are open, but those are leak channels that are designed to balance and maintain the membrane potential at a given voltage. The same thing is also true for the potassium channels. You have the closed ones, which are held in reserve for repolarization, but you also have the leak channels, which are also about balance, right? So the idea is here, the leak channels, both potassium and sodium, basically maintain resting membrane potential, RMP. Rocky Mountain Prep. Just kidding. I don't know if any of you guys were Rocky Mountain Prep alum, but that's, I don't know why that came to my mind. Just ignore that. So it's at this time of day, anything could come there. So then what happens is after you get the stimulus, right? So in step 2, the next piece that we get is depolarization, right? So we're going to get the opening of our sodium channels, and that's going to be in step 2. So the upswing of this curve is your depolarization curve. That's when you have the opening of your sodium channels, which are these large pink guys. And so when those channels open up, in rushes sodium. And so once that sodium rushes in, then you start to get that charge flip. That positive charge is basically flooding inward, and you get that depolarization event. Then right after that is going to be your repolarization. So this is basically when you're going to close your sodium channels, and then you're going to open up your potassium channels. And so at this particular point with repolarization, it's the downside of that curve. And so what happens there, so in this little segment right here, this is going to be a repolarization. Notice your sodium channels are going to close to disallow further inrush of sodium. And now those potassium channels that were held in reserve are going to open up, and it's going to allow potassium to rush out and thereby allow potassium's outrush of positive charge to essentially balance the system, right? To kind of counterbalance the inrush of sodium. And so you're balancing the system. And then the last piece, number 4, is typically a period of what's called hyperpolarization, where you actually get a little too good at counterbalancing. So you kind of overshoot your mark or your goal. And this is typically happening. This is something we refer to as after potential. It's usually caused because these potassium channels tend to stay open longer than we need them to stay open. And all that, but they don't close all at the same time. They kind of close sequentially. They kind of close one at a time. So you have persistent calcium channel opening. And so basically it kind of overreaches our resting membrane potential. So this is hyperpolarization. This is essentially due to persistent potassium channels being open. And so once they all close, then our sodium potassium pump will restore the ion balance and will bring it back up to resting membrane potential. So that's basically an action potential in a nutshell, 4-step process. Okay. And so then the next piece that we need for action potential is not just how do we create the action potential, but now how do we move the action potential down the axon or from one part of the membrane to another part, right? And so ultimately, when you have action potential in a local area, the plasma membrane that has been depolarized is basically here noted as a green band. And so the first thing that happens is you get depolarization. So this is your little strip of depolarization. You'll notice it's positive on the inside, negative on the outside. So this is basically your depolarized membrane. Now then, what happens is this positive charge, because you're talking about an inrush of positive charge, will essentially move to the next adjacent piece of membrane. So the depolarization of one stretch of membrane will basically create an action potential that triggers the opening of the voltage gates in the adjacent membrane. So for instance, this particular piece of membrane right here, which was depolarized a second ago, will actually trigger the voltage gated sodium channels in the next membrane. And so they will allow the sodium to rush in, and it means that they will become depolarized. So now you've gone from section 1 to now section 2. So that's basically the new depolarized piece. Same thing is also true. The inrush of sodium on this case will change the membrane potential, which will trigger the adjacent voltage gated sodium channels on the next piece of membrane to open up, and then the sodium will rush in here, depolarizing number 3. So number 2 and number 1 have already gone through the depolarization. So you can see how this little green wave of depolarization just keeps on rolling from one segment to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, all the way down, propagating itself down that membrane. So let's go ahead and kind of start putting a couple of things together. Just bear with me. Let's see where I put that slide. Okay, there it is. That's where I put it. So a couple of other things just to sort of link together. First of all, the neuromuscular junction, right? So basically, now that we have the idea of the action potential, which is AP here, you can see that this is rifling through the neurolemma, which is the membrane of the axon. And then as that basically hits these calcium channels, so these are basically voltage gated calcium channels. And so this will allow the inrush of calcium to come in, and that's the signal for these synaptic vesicles holding your acetylcholine to fuse with the membrane of the axon terminus and to release the acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. And so once the acetylcholine gets dumped into the synaptic cleft, then that is the release of the neurotransmitter. And then what's going to happen is the next step is going to be binding of your acetylcholine to these ligand-gated sodium channels at this particular point that are now in this sarcolemma. So remember, this is the motor end plate, which was kind of like the technical term for the sarcolemma of the target muscle cell. And so once this happens, it's going to open up that gate. It's going to allow sodium to rush in. Of course, we just learned that when sodium rushes in and a lot of positive charge rushes in, it creates a polarity flip that basically reignites that spontaneous action, that action potential of depolarization. So that's going to depolarize the membrane. And what's going to happen is then basically this is going to start rippling. That action potential is going to start rippling because in this membrane is a bunch of voltage gated sodium channels from here on out. And that's going to keep propagating this action potential, keeping it rolling through the sarcolemma. Okay. And that's basically propagating by the exact same mechanism that we just saw with this basically propagating green stripe. Okay. And so in this case, what's happening is you're going down the sarcolemma and then eventually you're going to hit the T tubule. So this is basically how you take the action potential, which is essentially your contraction signal, and you propagate or you communicate that to your target cell, which is your muscle cell. Okay. So that's basically the blab slide of this entire picture. This picture is showing you pretty much what all this says in words. So for those of you who like the verbal approach, that's the left side. For those of you who like the visual approach, that's the right side. Okay. So then after we get those gates open, right? So essentially what's going to happen is your sodium is going to enter into your muscle fiber. That's going to cause that postsynaptic depolarization. And that basically will start to move through the sarcolemma. But then what happens after that? Well, what happens after that is you got to clean up the mess, right? You threw the party, and now it's time to pick up all the trash, which is never a lot of fun. And so in order to do this, basically you have to reset the system. The first thing you have to do is acetylcholine will detach from the ligand gates. So for instance, here you can see you've got number 6, which is the closing of the sodium channels and the detachment of the acetylcholine. So you can see the acetylcholine is detaching. And then what's going to happen, and the next step is once it detaches, then the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which is a specific enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine into its constituent parts, which is acetic acid and choline, will actually come in and it'll cleave the acetylcholine and it'll cut it in half. So here's basically that piece right there, you can see the acetylcholine esterase grabbing onto the acetylcholine, and it's going to cut it in half. And so the first piece, the choline part, is going to be tethered to an enzyme that will basically recycle it. And so the motor neurons will actively resorb the choline with a transport protein. That's what you're seeing, that little green circle, that little green wheel right there. So this is basically a transporter that is actively taking in the choline and bringing that choline back into the neuron, where it will bundle that up with more acetic acid and reconstitute acetylcholine and package that into new synaptic vesicles, waiting for the next neural stimulus to come through, the next action potential to come through. So basically you use choline and you recycle it, and you basically make more acetylcholine with it. So what happens to the acetic acid then? So if you recycle the choline molecules so that you can continue to make acetylcholine and keep releasing it, the acetic acid is then basically plugged into glucose metabolism, right? You probably remember this from general bio. So there are different metabolic outcomes in cellular respiration, one of which is what's called acetyl-CoA, which is the beginning molecule that feeds into Krebs cycle. That may sound somewhat vaguely familiar to you guys. But that acetyl-CoA is an acetate, or an acetic acid, that basically is bound to a special molecule called a coenzyme, or CoA. That's what we call the CoA piece. It's like a shuttle, grabs onto an acetic acid or an acetate, and it basically moves it to the next place. That's the starting molecule for Krebs cycle. So you're plugging that acetic acid into the Krebs cycle so that you can generate energy and ATP. That's where the acetic acid is going. So nothing goes to waste. You don't just throw it away. You utilize it. And so the acetic acid will go basically to the Krebs cycle to make ATP. So that's what's happening at the neuromuscular junction. A lot going on there, right? So it's a very busy place, a lot of different things happening. So when we take a look at the coupling, so we have contraction, right? We have the sliding filament model. And then we have excitation, which we just talked about, right? So action potential generation and how it propagates through the neural lemma and then kind of jumps the gap to get to the sarcolemma. So that's excitation. So how do you put the two together, right? How do you actually connect the excitation component or the mechanism of excitation with the mechanism of contraction? That's what the excitation contraction coupling concept gives to us. So what happens is ultimately the components of both the electrical that we just talked about and the mechanical, which we talked about before that, is basically sort of linked together with this particular thing. So first of all, here's how it goes. Action potential, typically, which is produced on the sarcolemma, that's what we just saw, right? So after the acetylcholine jumps the gap and reignites that action potential in the sarcolemma, is then propagated through the sarcolemma and it dives down into the T tubules. And as it goes into the T tubules, remember the T tubules themselves are part of the triad. So basically, as your action potential goes down into the T tubules, then what's going to happen is that action potential, which is a change in voltage, is going to trip calcium channels, not just calcium channels, but voltage gated calcium channels that are on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the terminal cisterna. And so these guys are like right here. And so when they feel that voltage change coming through, they're basically going to dump calcium, open up. They're going to allow calcium to spill out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and basically enter into the sarcoplasm, or the sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber. And so as they spread throughout the sarcoplasm of the muscle fiber, they're going to find troponin. Remember, troponin is that protein molecule. It's part of the thin filament, who has three binding pieces, right? It has an actin binding, a tropomyosin binding, and a calcium binding domain. What happens is the calcium will come in to bind to troponin. And then so as the troponin is bound to calcium, what's going to happen is it's going to change shape. And because part of it is already bound to tropomyosin, or the tropomyosin is that rope-like protein that's covering up the G-actin spots the myosin heads have to get access to bind and to create cross bridges with. So what's going to happen is when that calcium binds to a troponin, it's going to change shape, and the troponin is going to basically roll over and pull the tropomyosin off of those actin binding sites, making them available for myosin head binding and cross bridge formation. And then once you get that, then you're going to get muscle contraction. So that's kind of what it looks like as it goes down the T-tubule. So the first step is it's going to start in the neuromuscular junction. So basically you have action potential propagation, where you have your sodium inrushing, which is going to flip the sodium gates, the voltage gates, which are going to continue to allow sodium to inrush. And then basically you have propagation in this direction as it goes down and starts diving into the T-tubules. So as it passes a calcium channel, so the calcium channels will sense this voltage change, and then basically it'll open up and it'll allow the calcium to rush out into the muscle fiber itself. Then once the calcium comes into the sarcomere, it's going to bind to the troponin on the thin filament. So here you can see the troponin is bound to the thin filament. That's going to change the shape of troponin, which is going to pull that tropomyosin rope off of these G-actin binding sites, allowing your myosin head to form a cross bridge, which is what it needs to do in order to be able to make contact and to pull. And then only then, once you've created your cross bridge, are you then able to go through your myosin cycle that we talked about last time, right? Which is that attachment, power stroke, detach, right? So this is basically now, once you get your myosin head attachment, you can see you've got exposure of your active sites. Your myosin heads will basically form and bind to those sites with ATP. Remember, ATP will basically hydrolyze into ADP plus phosphate. That's going to allow your myosin heads to bind to those actin binding sites. And then what's going to happen is from formation of cross bridge, you're going to do your power stroke. So you're going to lose your ADP. That's going to cause you to pull on the actin. So you're going to slide the actin in the opposite direction, like you're pulling on a tug of war rope. And then a new ATP is going to come in and bind to the myosin head, causing it to detach. So that's your detachment. And then essentially you go through the hydrolysis of ATP again, which basically restores your myosin head back to the original position. So oftentimes what will happen is the hydrolysis of ATP is required for detachment. And then once it detaches, it's able to sort of recock. So that's the recovery stroke. So basically recocks the trigger, so to speak, and then you're ready to go through another round of cross bridge formation. Okay. And you just keep doing this over and over and over again. So then basically what happens is as your myosin head continues to pull in this direction, it's going to continue to slide your actin in the forward direction. That's going to happen as long as calcium is bound to troponin, giving your myosin heads access to the G-actin. And so that's going to continue to work. Of course, then ATP is essentially required to reset so that you can do another round of contraction. Okay, so this is just kind of a bigger image of cross bridge formation. So that was a bigger image of the active beginning piece of it, where you have the exposure, basically this in larger images. And so you can see you've got the exposure of the actin sites, and also you have a cocked and ready myosin head ready to bind. Next step is to form the cross bridges, right, where the myosin head will actually bind to the individual cross bridges. And then that allows you to get access to, notice that is accompanied with the loss of the integrinic phosphate. And now you only have ADP attached to it. Then once ADP leaves, that's going to leave behind the energy that will allow you to power stroke this thing and pull that actin filament, and it's going to slide it in this direction. So there's your power stroke. Then after your power stroke, you're basically going to bring in another ATP, which is going to bind to the myosin head. That's going to allow it to detach from the cross bridge. And then hydrolysis of the ATP basically sets the stage for its energy. At this point, you haven't recocked it yet. You recock it right after you do the hydrolysis. So basically, the recovery stroke will allow you to bend that back so that you can grab onto the next piece and basically pull that forward. So basically what you're doing is something like this. You're basically kind of grabbing it like this, and you're just going like this. So you're pulling it. So I grab onto it. That's my attachment. Power stroke, detach. Then I do it again. Recock, grab onto it, power stroke, detach. Recock, grab onto it, power stroke, detach. Okay. So it's kind of like that. Of course, now you have, remember, these myosin heads in all three dimensions of X, Y, Z. So they're basically all the way around grabbing onto that actin in all three dimensions. So basically, when you have a single contraction, each filament will go through this cycle of cross bridge formation, and of course, its consequent release and so forth. And so you want to make sure you give that thing a chance to sort of do its recovery stroke, right? So this is kind of the piece that's happening down here. So this is kind of like a recapitulation of what we saw before, only now what we've done is we've tossed in the neuromuscular junction. And so this kind of gets us to a little bit of our sort of summary of our action potential. And so this is basically kind of our muscle contraction, from top to bottom, right? Going from ultimately the propagation of action potential coming from the neuron to finally the excitation contraction cycle. And so this is basically how it works. To sum it all up, in the first step, your action potential is going to basically ripple down the neurolemma. As it runs into these voltage-gated calcium channels, it's going to trip them. They're going to open up and allow the inrush of calcium. That calcium is the signal that causes your synaptic vesicles full of acetylcholine or whatever neurotransmitter you have to be working with to basically fuse with the membrane and dump its contents, in this case acetylcholine, into the synaptic cleft. From that point, acetylcholine is going to basically cross the synaptic cleft and bind to ligand-gated sodium channels in the postsynaptic membrane, which is your muscle sarcolemma, opening up those channels, allowing the sodium to inrush. And by inrushing, it's going to basically flip the charge, right? So that's essentially what's going to happen in number 4. So basically, it opens up those sodium channels, and that basically kicks off the action potential in the sarcolemma. However, the way that you essentially clean up the mess, so to speak, to clear out your synaptic cleft so you can reset your system for another stimulus is acetylcholinesterase is basically going to take that acetylcholine and it's going to break that acetylcholine into choline and acetic acid. The choline will be recycled and used to make more acetylcholine. And then the acetic acid piece will go off into metabolism to make ATP. Now then, as your action potential starts to propagate and roll through the sarcolemma, itself is going to be triggering more sodium voltage-gated sodium channels, which is going to allow the inrush of sodium, causing a depolarization, which will continue to cause the action potential to generate or to propagate through the sarcolemma. And as it hits a T-tubule, it's going to start dipping down into the T-tubule, where eventually it's going to trigger a calcium channel that is also voltage-gated in the sarcoplasmic reticulum that'll open up and allow the efflux or the outrush of calcium, which is the major trigger for contraction. The calcium then is going to be moving to and going toward the sarcomere, where it's specifically going to bind to the calcium binding domain of troponin. The troponin then is going to change shape. And as it changes shape, the piece of the troponin that's bound to the tropomyosin, which is at the moment covering those actin sites that myosin needs to attach to, is going to change shape. It's going to pull the tropomyosin like you're rolling over or pulling the covers over with you. And it's going to pull that tropomyosin off of those active sites, allowing the myosin heads access and availability to attach to those G-actin sites. That basically is going to be done along with the excitation contraction cycle, which we basically saw up here, right? So once you get access to those sites, then you're going to bind to your myosin heads. After that, that myosin is going to experience the exiting of the ADP, which is going to give it the energy it needs to do the power stroke, which is going to pull on the actin filaments as they start to move in toward each other. Another ATP will come in and basically bind to the myosin head, allowing it to detach from the actin filament. And then when it hydrolyzes, it's going to prime and then recock the myosin head so that it can reattach to an already available, because calcium is still there, an already available actin head. And then if you keep doing this over and over, those myosin heads are just going to keep on grabbing and pulling, grabbing and pulling. And eventually what's going to happen is those sarcomeres from Z disc to Z disc, because that's where the actin filaments are attached to, are going to slowly start to slide inward, and that's going to shorten the sarcomere. You shorten multiple sarcomeres over distance, then you're going to start to shorten the muscle. And if you shorten the muscle, you're going to create tension, which you can use to lift this iPad Pro. Okay, that probably hurt your head a little bit. But the good thing is, in this chapter, if you can do that, if you can basically go from the top all the way through neuromuscular junction, all the way through diving down into the T-tubules, all the way down into sliding filament, all the way down into excitation coupling, and you can like not miss a beat, then you're in a good place, right? You're in a very, very good place for this chapter. That is a good chunk of this chapter. As a matter of fact, everything early on in the early parts of this chapter were all leading up to that one big rundown, going from the motor neuron all the way down to the excitation contraction coupling mechanism. Okay. So that's nice. Now we're contracted. But then what? We can't stay contracted, can we? It can never be that easy, right? Basically, now what we need to do is we need to realize that we need to relax our muscles. And we can't really do any kind of we can't contract our muscles again unless they're relaxed. So we have to relax them now that they've contracted. So basically, what we have are ATP dependent events, a couple of them that are going to help us to repolarize or relax our muscle. Right? Notice this. Notice we said here they're ATP dependent. What does that mean? That means you need energy, which is one of the reasons why you don't just let that acetic acid get away for nothing, right? You go send that to go make some ATP with, because you're going to need ATP. So for muscle relaxation, the three things that you're going to need is typically the sodium potassium pump has got to be actively transporting sodium out of the fiber, potassium into the fiber. That's what it does for a living. And so this will basically restore your resting membrane to potential. That's number one, right? You got to reset that system. You got to reset your resting membrane potential. That's the sodium potassium pump's job. That's what it does for a living. That requires ATP. It's an ATP driven process. You also need ATP to detach those myosin heads. If you can't detach those myosin heads, then you're going to stay contracted, right? This is kind of the idea of rigor mortis. So the idea that your muscles stay perpetually contracted when you're dead because you're not making any more ATP, so you don't have any more ATP in your body to detach all those myosin heads from your muscles. So for a period of time, they stay contracted until they degrade naturally, and then your muscles kind of start to release and let go. Right, that's another one that's going to require ATP. The other one also that you're going to need is for the active transport of calcium. Remember, what we just did was we just made a mess, didn't we? We spilled calcium all over the muscle fiber. It's everywhere now. As a matter of fact, as long as you let that calcium stay bound to troponin, those actin heads are always going to be available, which means those actin heads can always be subject to forming cross bridges, basically perpetual contraction. So in order to stop contracting, you've got to reset your system. You've got to clean up your mess, right? So where you have channels, you always have pumps, right? The two go together. Always remember that. That's probably one thing you didn't get in general bio. But it's one thing I like to hammer into my students in general bio, because half of my students are pre-health, and I know they're going to have this conversation someday. So always remember, whenever you have a channel, like a sodium channel or a potassium channel or a calcium channel, always remember that they're allowing gradients to basically flow downhill, right? That doesn't come for free. Wherever you see a concentration gradient, somebody had to build it. That somebody is a pump somewhere nearby that did that hard labor. So who's building the sodium concentration gradient? The sodium potassium pump. Who's building the potassium gradient? The sodium potassium pump. Who's building the calcium gradient? The calcium pump, right? Anywhere you see an ion gradient, know that there's a pump nearby that is the one who's setting the mousetrap, so to speak. Oftentimes in physiology, we like to think of like releasing the mousetrap, right? Because we want to see the mousetrap catch a mouse. But we don't really think it all the way through a lot of times, because for every mousetrap you release, you have to reset the mousetrap to do it again, right? And that's why I say every time you see a channel, there's a pump that goes with it. And those pumps typically are ATP driven. So whenever you release all that calcium outside of those calcium channels, guess what you have to do? You have to pump all that calcium back in. That one's not so much fun, is it? I mean, it's a lot of fun making the mess when you're at a party. Not so much fun cleaning up the mess after the party, right? And so, but it's necessary, right? And so that's basically what's happening. So here you can see, for the first time, they actually have this one, where you can see the calcium pump here. So basically, you can see the calcium pump is pumping a calcium ion, dumping that back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it's using a hydrogen ion as its counter. So basically, there's two things going on. It's kind of like you did with the sodium potassium pump. One's going in, one's going out. In this case, the calcium's coming in, the hydrogen ion is going out. And so that's your calcium pump, but that requires ATP. It's an energetic process. So all three of these are necessary to basically make sure that you get repolarization, or rather muscular relaxation. Okay, so now that we have those two down, let's go ahead and take a look at the nature of the muscle twitch, the dynamics of contraction relative to relaxation. So muscle twitch basically is just kind of a goofy way, in some sense, of just basically saying a muscle contraction cycle, right? So there's basically phases of the muscle fiber, and its response is contraction response to a particular stimulus, right? So you get a single action potential along with motor neuron, and basically you have a couple of phases. So we talked a little bit about this, not a whole lot, but a little bit. So this is kind of a recapitulation of what we talked about earlier. So you have a couple of phases. The first one is going to be your lag phase, or your latent phase, I think is what we called it before. This is basically from 0 to the stimulus beginning to the beginning of contraction, right? So basically the lag phase is that time when it's kind of going through and jumping over the synaptic cleft. It's going down the T tubules. It's moving toward the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so all that process before it actually gets to any kind of contraction, that's going to be part of the latent or the lag phase. Number 2 is going to be the contraction phase. This is where the sarcoplasmic reticulum will actually release the calcium. And then once it does that, it's going to immediately bind to the troponin, making available those cross bridges. And so that's where you're going to get your contraction phase. You can see you have an upswing in tension because of your contraction, right? So you basically shorten the size of the muscle, which basically is going to produce tension. And so that's the contraction cycle, and then that's going to be followed by relaxation, which is basically where all that calcium returns to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and you kind of reset the system, and notice you have your relaxation phase on the back side. So this is basically how a muscle twitch curve tends to look. Notice you get in the upslope, the positive slope is going to be your contraction phase. The backside of the slope, the negative slope, is going to be your relaxation phase, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're basically reducing in tension. So you would expect it to be negative in slope because it's diminishing because you're relaxing, right, at that point. Notice, however, one thing, not to confuse this with, when you're taking a look at a twitch curve, it looks very similar, doesn't it? Very similar to what we saw before. It looks very similar to the action potential curve that we saw before. So the case here is they're not the same, right? One is looking at millivolts, it's voltage over time. So it's looking at depolarization, repolarization. That is the cause. The second one is looking at the effect, right? So the effect of depolarization is contraction, and the effect of repolarization is relaxation, right? So ultimately, they're similar, but not the same. Sometimes it's difficult to keep the two straight whenever you're looking at something, because sometimes we'll look at the depolarization curves, and sometimes physiologically we'll look at the twitch curves. And so it's sometimes very easy to get the two mixed up, right? So what kinds of muscle contractions can we generate? Well, there's a couple of different types. First of all, we have what's called the isometric type of contraction. So this is essentially when you don't have a change in length of the muscle, but your tension increases. For instance, a good example of this is your postural muscles, where they're not changing in length, they're not shortening, they're just constantly contracting, and they're just maintaining an increased tension, right? This is what's keeping you upright. If they were changing in length, what would happen is you would basically be kind of bending backwards like this all the time. So because they'd be shortening and lengthening and shortening and lengthening, kind of the way your bicep does when you're shortening and lengthening your bicep, it's moving your arm to an acute angle versus a more obtuse angle, right? So this is basically no change in length with a change in tension. Isotonic is basically a situation where you have a change in length, but your tension is constant. So instead of increasing tension, you've got constant tension and your length changes. Okay. So let's take a look at motor units, the organization of how this is all put together, because this is the communication or the wiring system, if you will, of your muscles. So basically, when you take a look at your muscles, they're organized in what's called motor units. And in a motor unit, basically what you're going to have is a single motor neuron, and all the muscle fibers that are basically connected to it, that it's responsible for communicating with. Remember that a motor neuron will branch out into these little axon termini. They're called telodendria. They're like little tentacles that will basically attach to different nerve fibers, and basically they'll essentially attach to all these different bundles. Okay, so you have multiple attachment points, multiple neuromuscular junctions from a single motor neuron. And so all these muscle fibers plus the motor neuron is considered a motor unit. It's like a team, like you're my work team, right? So ultimately, the action potential coming from the motor neuron essentially will communicate that contraction signal to all the muscle fibers of that unit. So when we're talking about that neuromuscular junction where the action potential comes down it and basically releases acetylcholine, it's doing that not just for one muscle fiber, it's doing that for every muscle fiber that it's connected to in its motor unit. So you get multiple muscle fibers that are getting the same signal from the same motor neuron at the same time. Okay. Now, when you take a look at motor units, because you basically got different muscle fibers connected to single individual motor neurons, you can have a little bit of organizational flexibility here. For instance, if you take a look at a large muscle, a bulk muscle, right? So these basically will have motor units in them that will have a lot of muscle fibers in them. And so typically this is what causes gross motor movement. So just something crude. Your bicep is a good example, right? You're not playing a piano with your bicep. All you're doing is one action, flexion. That's it. That's all it does. And usually it's flexion of a fairly decent load, right? Half the time we're picking up something that's relatively on the heavy side. And so our bicep is designed really for power and not for nimbleness or flexibility, right? So as a result, you have motor units with lots of muscle fibers in them. Small muscles, like your forearm muscles, the ones that we're learning tonight, the flexors and the extensors. By the way, you were starting that process last time too, so it's not like it's just tonight. Everybody looks at me like, what? So these are the small muscles, like in your forearm, And oftentimes these guys will have few muscle fibers in each motor unit. But what this does is it provides not power, but fine motor movement. So if you've wondered how come your arm extensors and your flexors are tiny, it's because the motor units in those muscles have very few muscle fibers in them. What that does is it gives you much finer motor control that you can use to basically manipulate your hands and your fingers. This is what allows us to be able to play the piano, as opposed to just like gross motor movement where we're just banging on the thing, right? Because that's all we've got. Like a dog, for instance. And that's the one part with the cat, right? A cat doesn't have fine motor control because they don't have those tiny muscles. Most of theirs are big, so they don't really have a lot of that fine motor skill. The finer you want your motor skills to be, which gives us our ability to grasp and to grab onto things, you need smaller and smaller muscles, right? So it's all about strategy. Like, what are you trying to accomplish in terms of your function? If you're looking for that fine motor control, then you have to have lots of small fibers, small muscles with few fibers per motor unit. That's what's going to give you that variation so that you can really get a lot of that fine detail in your hands. Notice are considerably bigger than the ones in your arms. Did you guys notice that from the cats? Right? So you notice you have the same things, right? You have extensors in the leg. You have flexors in the leg, like extensor digitorum longus, which is the one that extends your toes. But that muscle is pretty big, isn't it? That's the one that's just to the side of the one that's by your shin, right? Which is your tibia. So the tibialis anterior is the one next to your shin. The one next to that is your extensor digitorum longus. But notice the extensors that are in your arm are much smaller, much more fine-tuned for much better manipulation. You can't manipulate your foot the way you can your hand because the leg muscles are a lot bigger. They're more bulky, have more muscle fibers in them and per motor unit than the ones in your hand. You're not designed to grasp things with your feet, even though sometimes we do, right? Pick up a bowl on the floor with your toes. Okay, so ultimately, when you're taking a look at the force of contraction, like for instance, in an individual muscle fiber, then we have to break them down to the actual myofibril point, right? So this kind of gets to the strength of the muscle contraction for the workout warriors. This is one that really always interests them, right? Because they're looking for maximum strength out of their muscle contraction. And so you can vary your muscle contraction, right? You can attenuate it from a weak to a very strong type of a response. And so the important thing is that when you take a look at your muscle, it responds in this sort of variable kind of attenuated fashion, right? And I think I made the mention, like with my iPad Pro, basically, I have to basically take my bicep and I have to attenuate my bicep to basically hold my iPad Pro. But can my bicep produce more tension than that? Yeah, by a lot, right? So if I wanted to maximum contract, I could throw this thing up to the ceiling. But that obviously would not be what I want, right? So you have this graded contraction, and it all basically is communicated by the force that's being pushed on those individual muscle fibers. So what this is basically saying is that not only can you create force and tension, but basically you can adapt the tension to match the force of the load. The heavier it is, the stronger you can contract. The lighter it is, the lighter you can contract. Okay, so that's kind of an important thing. And so ultimately, if you can, if you need like an attenuated type of contraction, the attenuation gets down to the number of cross bridges that you create. So if you basically increase the number of cross bridges, and you can only do this to a certain degree, because the amount of overlap you have in a sarcomere is fairly standard, right? So, but if you have just a little bit more myosin head attachment in a sarcomere, and you multiply that over thousands and thousands of sarcomeres, then you can get a cumulative effect that can create a lot more force in your muscle. Okay, so that's one thing you can do. One thing that can increase your cross bridge number is, first of all, the number of times that you form these cross bridges, right, per minute. So if you keep attaching, detach, attach, and detach, so if I keep doing this, then I can basically spend more of my time attached and pulling than unattached, right? So that's one way to do it. The other one is by the diameter of the muscle fiber. So increasing the diameter will give me more myosin connection, and that'll give me more power. By the way, this is bodybuilding. And muscle fiber length at the time of contraction. So this is basically max relaxation or max stretch. So one thing in muscleology is, in order to contract, you can only contract as well as you stretch. So if your sarcomeres are not maximally stretched out and distended to give you that maximum amount, then you're not going to contract fully. If you only stretch out a little bit, you're only going to contract that little bit, right? So if you get maximum stretch followed by maximum contraction followed by maximum stretch again, that's going to give you maximum force. Okay. So that's basically what you're doing when you're kind of stretching out your muscles, among other things. So you're kind of stretching all that out, getting the sarcomeres good and stretched out. Plus, you're also increasing circulation. So you're doing a lot of things going on there. Bodybuilding and building mass. This is oftentimes kind of a little bit of a misconception. Is that a lot of times, and people think that they're adding muscle fibers. They're not. You don't change the number of muscle fibers in your muscle. What you do is you change the diameter of the muscle fibers you have by creating or packing more myofilaments in them. So for instance, if you have a person who does not work out, their muscle is going to be like maybe that big of a diameter with a certain number of myofilaments in it. As they work out and their muscle gets bigger, it's not the fibers. You don't increase the fibers in the fascicle, right? That's not what you do. What you do is you increase the number of myofilaments that you pack into that muscle fiber, so that muscle fiber gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then as each of those muscle fibers gets bigger because you're packing more myofilaments into it, then that increases the size of the fascicle, which then increases the size of the overall muscle itself. Not only that, but then when you stop working out, then your body realizes, oh, I see. So we're not interested in lifting weights anymore, huh? Okay, then we don't need all this extra musculature. It's a waste of energy, right? Then what happens is you just start to say like, okay, I guess we don't need all these muscle filaments because we're not putting that much force on this muscle anymore. So we're going to just start to break down those myofilaments, and we're going to bring that muscle back down to a size that's a little bit more adjusted to what your loads are now, right? And this is the reason why your body kind of expands as it gets bulkier, but then also why it kind of contracts as you kind of stop working out and your muscles kind of start getting back kind of more to a normal size. Because your body, just like your bones, are always basically adjusting themselves and adapting to what's happening to your body at this time. And that's basically bodybuilding. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at frequency of stimulation. So the frequency of stimulation basically can come along differently, right? So for instance, here we have our normal twitch curve, our tension curve. So our stimulus is applied, right? That's our depolarization, that whole thing going on right there, right? So we have our lag phase as it basically makes its way through the sarcolemma down to the T-tubules. We get our contraction curve, and then we get our repolarization or relaxation rather side of it. And so that's our basic twitch curve. So generally speaking, when we take a look at the frequency of stimulation, we have a couple of different patterns that we see. So one of them is called, it's a German word, Treppe. And so essentially, you have calcium that's released according to the first stimulus. That's generally what you'll see first. But maybe it's not completely removed by that sarcoplasmic reticulum before the second stimulus comes around. So that means it hasn't had a chance to sort of reset itself. So it's not completely reset. And so you still have calcium out there that's being cleaned up by the time the second stimulus comes in and causes the release of more calcium. And so basically, the muscle has been able to relax between the muscle twitches, but you kind of have a little bit of an inefficiency in your resetting of your calcium. So then, what is the consequence? So you get full relaxation, but you don't get that full calcium cleanup. So what's the consequence is in the next contraction, what's going to happen is the sarcoplasmic reticulum concentration will increase slightly. And what this will do is because there's calcium already out there, it's going to basically cause these cross bridge formations to be a little bit more efficient. For athletes, for instance, Treppe is achieved during your warm up. So you kind of warm yourself up a little bit to kind of get things going, to kind of prime the pump, right? So this is kind of like you've sort of primed the pump. So you have a little bit of calcium out there. It's not completely cleaned up. And so it's going to be more likely that you're going to get full contraction on the next round because you already have some calcium out there. So you don't have to worry about just sort of starting off from scratch. Okay? And so that's kind of what happens as you're warming up. You're just basically kind of, it's a low level, just sort of communicating your muscles. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, you guys, you need to get into this twitch curve thing, release your calcium, get it out there, get ready because there's going to be another stimulus coming to tell you guys to wake up and to contract. So ultimately, there's a lot of other things that are kind of involved in this as well. So this kind of gives you a little bit of improved muscle efficiency because of you're kind of priming that pump. You're kind of already getting the muscles kind of ready for contraction. So they're already in a ready state to basically take on more load. You're also communicating to your tissues. You're bringing in an increase in blood flow. So you're beginning that process. And also, perfect. That was actually perfect. I just want to finish this slide. Sorry. It's been doing this all day long. It's been driving me insane. There we go. So it increases your blood flow. So you're getting more oxygen to your muscles. Your body temperature is coming up, which is facilitating that blood flow, which is bringing nutrients and oxygen to your muscles. So they're getting well fed before you really start your workout, right? So by the time you start your workout, your muscles are already ready to go. They're ready and they're fed and they've got oxygen. So they're like primed. They're like really ready to go. So this is one of the reasons why it's particularly beneficial, especially in athletes, to warm up and things of that nature. Ultimately, then, after a few contractions of this sort of inefficient calcium mop up, if you will, the contraction that is made by each subsequent contraction is equal to the previous contraction. So it kind of tails off, basically. And so I'll kind of show you, this is not a Treppe curve. I'll show you a Treppe curve. I'm going to add one. I'm going to look for one. I'm going to add it in there. But that's basically a type of frequency of stimulation where you can kind of stimulate and prime your muscles to kind of improve themselves for activity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the other types of curve, wave summation, and tetanus. And we'll kind of start from there.